I'm Elsie Morgan, 62 years old, and nothing prepares you for seeing your only child unconscious in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. When I got that late-night call from a nurse, I knew something was terribly wrong. I never imagined I'd find Michael dying alone while his wife Natalie popped champagne on a yacht with friends. The rage that filled me was like nothing I'd ever known. So I did what any mother would do. I protected my son the only way I could. I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you believe family should be there in times of crisis, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community. You won't believe what happened just 1 hour after I froze all her accounts. The call came at 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember checking the time wondering who would be calling so late. My first thought was telemarketers, though even they usually respect decent hours. I almost didn't answer, but something pushed me to reach for the phone. Thank God I did. Is this Elsie Morgan? A woman's voice asked, professional, but with an unmistakable edge of concern. Yes, this is she, I replied, already sitting up in bed, my heart beginning to race for reasons I couldn't yet articulate. Mrs. Morgan, my name is Susan Chen. I'm a nurse at Washington Memorial Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Michael. In that moment, the world stopped. Every mother recognizes that feeling, that instant freeze when you hear your child might be in danger. It doesn't matter if they're 5 or 50. What's happened to Michael? I managed to ask, already out of bed and turning on lights. He's been admitted to our intensive care unit with severe pneumonia that's progressed to sepsis. He's in serious condition, Mrs. Morgan. My mind raced with questions. How long has he been there? Is Natalie with him? Can I speak to him? There was a pause on the line. He's been here for 3 days, Mrs. Morgan. He's currently sedated and intubated. As for his wife, she's not present. In fact, no family has been here with him since admission. The words hit me like physical blows. 3 days. My son had been fighting for his life for 3 days, and I was just now finding out I found your contact information in his phone. Susan continued. I'm not supposed to do this, but he asked repeatedly for someone to call his wife. When that didn't seem to be happening, I felt I needed to reach out to family. I will forever be grateful to Susan for breaking protocol that night. She didn't know it then, but she quite possibly saved my son's life. I'm coming. I'll get the first flight out. I told her already, mentally calculating what I needed to do. After getting the hospital details, I immediately tried calling Natalie. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. I sent text messages that showed as delivered but received no response. My hands shook as I booked the earliest flight from Phoenix to Washington, D.C. A 6 a.m. departure that would get me there by early afternoon. It was the longest night of my life, those hours spent packing a bag, arranging for my neighbor to watch my house, and trying repeatedly to reach my daughter-in-law. As I moved through these mechanical tasks, memories of Michael's childhood flooded back. He had been prone to respiratory infections as a child. At 8, he had developed pneumonia that had terrified me and Thomas, my late husband. We had taken turns sitting by his hospital bed for a week, Thomas reading Hardy Boys mysteries aloud, while I cooled Michael's forehead with damp cloths. Thomas and I had promised each other then that we would always protect our son. After Thomas died from cancer 5 years ago, that promise became even more sacred to me. It was a promise I carried alone now. Michael had moved to Washington 3 years ago for a position at the National Institutes of Health. He was doing groundbreaking research on autoimmune diseases, work that made both of us proud. He had met Natalie shortly after the move, a beautiful, charismatic woman 12 years his junior who worked in pharmaceutical marketing. From the beginning, something about Natalie had made me uneasy. She was charming when she needed to be, but I caught glimpses of coldness of calculation. She would cut Michael off when he spoke about his work, roll her eyes when he wasn't looking. Small things, perhaps, but a mother notices. When they married after a whirlwind 6-month courtship, I had expressed gentle concern to Michael. Are you sure this isn't moving too fast? I had asked. When you know, Mom, he had replied with that boyish smile that had never changed since childhood. Besides, I'm not getting any younger. At their wedding, Natalie had been perfectly cordial to me, but kept me at a distance. In the 2 years since our relationship had remained polite, but chilly. She rarely joined Michael for our weekly video calls, and when they visited Arizona at Christmas, she spent most of the time on her phone or suggesting expensive activities none of us really enjoyed. As my flight took off the next morning, I stared out at the rising sun with a single thought: how could any spouse leave their partner alone in a hospital for 3 days? No matter what else happened, I knew in that moment that Natalie was not the woman I had hoped she would be for my son. The flight was interminable, made worse by turbulence and a crying baby. I couldn't even feel annoyed at the infant. Its distress mirrored my own inner turmoil. I attempted to nap, but managed only brief snatches of restless sleep, punctuated by worrying dreams. By the time I landed in Washington, I had been awake for nearly 30 hours, fueled by airport coffee and maternal fear. I went straight from the airport to the hospital, not even stopping to check into a hotel. My bag rolled behind me as I navigated the hospital corridors, following signs to the intensive care unit with a single-minded determination. Nothing could have prepared me for what I found. The ICU was eerily quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the mechanical whoosh of ventilators. A nurse directed me to bay number 4, where privacy curtains were partially drawn around the bed. I hesitated for just a moment, steeling myself, then pushed the curtain aside. The sight knocked the breath from my lungs. Michael, my strong, brilliant son, lay unconscious, a breathing tube down his throat, his face ashen against the white hospital pillows. Multiple IV lines ran into his arms, delivering medications and fluids. A monitor displayed his heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels, all numbers that told me he was alive but deeply unwell. I dropped my bag and rushed to his side, taking his limp hand in mine. His skin felt hot, fevered. "Michael," I whispered, "Mom's here now. I'm here." A doctor in blue scrubs approached, introducing himself as Dr. Patel. "Mrs. Morgan, I'm the attending physician for your son." "How is he?" I asked, not taking my eyes off Michael's face. Dr. Patel's expression was grave. "He's very ill. The pneumonia developed rapidly and progressed to sepsis before he was brought in. We've had him on broad-spectrum antibiotics, but he's been slow to respond. His fever isn't breaking as we'd hope, and his kidney function is concerning us." "Will he—" I couldn't finish the question. "We're doing everything we can." Dr. Patel said the standard medical non-answer that tells you everything about how serious the situation is. "The next 48 hours will be critical." I nodded, trying to absorb this information. "I understand he's been here for 3 days. "Yes, he collapsed at work and was brought in by ambulance. From what his colleagues told us, he'd been visibly ill for about a week before that, but kept working." That sounded like Michael, dedicated to a fault, unwilling to let illness slow him down, just like his father had been. "And his wife hasn't been here?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Dr. Patel hesitated. "She came the first day briefly. We haven't seen her since, despite our calls updating her on his condition." A young nurse approached, recognition dawning on her face. "Mrs. Morgan, I'm Susan. We spoke on the phone." I grasped her hand gratefully. "Thank you for calling me. I can't tell you what that meant." When Dr. Patel left to continue his rounds, Susan lingered. "I'm not supposed to get involved," she said quietly, "but it wasn't right. He kept asking for his wife, and when I'd call, she'd say she was coming, but never show up." "Do you know where she is?" I asked. Susan bit her lip, then pulled out her phone. "I probably shouldn't show you this, but—" She opened Instagram and navigated to a profile. "This is public, so anyone can see it." The profile belonged to Natalie. The most recent post from just 5 hours earlier showed her in a bikini on what appeared to be the deck of a luxury yacht, champagne glass in hand, surrounded by equally glamorous friends. The caption read, "Sometimes you need to choose joy, #living my best life, #yacht day, #champagne problems." My blood turned to ice in my veins. While my son fought for his life, tubes breathing for him, Natalie was partying on a yacht. "There are more," Susan said gently, scrolling to show posts from the previous 2 days, all showing various parties, fancy restaurants, and social gatherings. "Has she called to check on him at all?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Once yesterday. She asked if there was any change, and when I said his condition remained serious, she said she'd try to come by tomorrow, but had unavoidable commitments today. Unavoidable commitments, like yacht parties. I thanked Susan and asked to be alone with Michael. When she left, I pulled a chair close to his bed and held his hand, speaking to him softly as tears ran down my face. I told him I was there, that I wasn't going anywhere, that he was going to get through this. All the while, a cold fury was building inside me. This wasn't just neglect. This felt deliberate callous. What kind of person abandons their critically ill spouse for parties? I needed to understand what was happening, and for that I needed more information. Susan had mentioned they had kept Michael's personal effects secure. His phone might provide some answers. When Susan returned for her checks, I asked about his belongings. She brought me a plastic hospital bag containing his wallet keys, wedding ring removed due to swelling, and smartphone. Using his fingerprint, which I pressed gently to the sensor, I unlocked the device. What I found turned my blood cold. The text messages told a story more disturbing than I could have imagined. I scrolled through the exchange between Michael and Natalie from the week before his hospitalization. Michael: feeling worse today. Fever's up to 102. Might need to see a doctor. Natalie: just take some Tylenol. Probably just a cold. 2 days later, Michael: can barely get out of bed. Coughing up something weird. Can you come home early, Natalie? Have that dinner with the Merck reps. Don't be dramatic. It's just pneumonia. People don't die from that anymore. The day of his collapse, Michael: at work but can't breathe well. Dizzy. Think I should go to ER. Natalie: OMG, stop texting me during my meeting. Do what you need to do. Then from the hospital, Michael in hospital. Doctor says serious. Can you come, Natalie? In middle of event. We'll try later. Michael: please come. They're putting me in ICU. Natalie: can't get away right now. Tomorrow. Michael: having trouble breathing. They might put me on ventilator. Scared. Please come. Natalie: you'll be fine. Doctors are dramatic. Getting my hair done. Will try to stop by after. The messages continued, becoming increasingly desperate from Michael and increasingly dismissive from Natalie. The last messages from Michael, sent 3 days ago, simply read, "Please." There was no response. I set the phone down, hands shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. How could she? How could anyone be so callous towards someone they supposedly loved? But the phone revealed even more concerning information. As a former financial advisor, I quickly navigated to Michael's banking apps. What I found confirmed my growing suspicions. Their joint checking account, which should have contained around $50,000 based on Michael's salary and their expenses, was down to just over $8,000. Credit card statements showed massive charges from high-end retailers, restaurants, and just 2 days ago, a yacht charter company. There were also emails from their insurance company responding to inquiries Natalie had made about Michael's life insurance policy, a substantial one he had taken out after their marriage. She had been asking about beneficiary confirmation and payout procedures just 1 week before he fell ill. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. This wasn't just neglect. This looked deliberate, calculated. My financial background set off every alarm bell. Natalie wasn't just partying while Michael was ill. She was spending their money at an alarming rate, inquiring about his life insurance, and leaving him alone when he was most vulnerable. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. A man in his 30s with glasses and a concerned expression peered in. "Mrs. Morgan, I'm James Wilson. I work with Michael at NIH. I invited him in, grateful for a friendly face. James approached the bed, visibly shocked at Michael's condition. "I had no idea it was this bad," he said quietly. "The rumors around the lab were that he had pneumonia, but was recovering at home." "Rumors? Haven't you spoken to Natalie?" James shifted uncomfortably. "That's partly why I came. No one's been able to reach her for updates. A few of us were going to try to visit Michael at home this weekend, thinking he was there recuperating. He's been here for 3 days, James, in intensive care. Natalie hasn't been here except for a brief visit the first day." James's expression darkened. That explains some things." "What things?" He hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak ill of my daughter-in-law. "Please," I urged. "Michael needs all the help he can get right now. I need to understand what's happening." "There have been rumors," James said carefully. Natalie's been seen around town at various events parties, always without Michael, always with the same group of people, particularly with one man, Richard Caldwell. He's a pharmaceutical executive, very wealthy. Are you suggesting she's having an affair? James wouldn't quite meet my eyes. I don't know for certain, but there's been talk, and seeing Michael like this knowing she's not here, it doesn't look good. After James left, promising to organize a rotation of colleagues to visit, I sat by Michael's bed in a state of cold calculation. Everything I was learning pointed to a terrible conclusion. Natalie wasn't just neglectful, she was potentially dangerous to my son's well-being. I pulled out my own phone and made a call to the hospital's social services department. I'd like to speak with someone about my options for protecting a vulnerable adult family member, I said when they answered. The social worker who came to speak with me, a compassionate woman named Diane, listened carefully to my concerns, examining the evidence I'd gathered from Michael's phone. "This is deeply concerning," she agreed. "Given his current incapacity and the evidence of financial exploitation, you may have grounds for emergency intervention. Do you know if Michael has any advance directives or power of attorney documents?" I didn't know. But with Diane's help, we searched Michael's email and cloud storage. There we found something Natalie had clearly missed or forgotten: a medical power of attorney document Michael had prepared years ago after his father's difficult passing. He had named me his mother as his medical decision-maker should he become incapacitated. The document had never been revoked or replaced after his marriage. "This gives you clear authority for medical decisions," Diane explained. "For financial protection, we need to act quickly before more damage is done." I thought of Thomas, of the promise we had made to protect our son. I knew what I had to do. With the medical power of attorney document in hand, I moved with surprising efficiency for someone who hadn't slept in over 30 hours. My years as a financial advisor had prepared me well for this moment, though I had never imagined using those skills to protect my own son from his wife. My first call was to Patrick, a former colleague who had specialized in emergency financial interventions for elderly or vulnerable clients. I explained the situation while pacing outside Michael's room. "Jesus, Elsie," Patrick said when I finished. "That's horrific. What can I do?" "I need to know my options. I have medical power of attorney, but I need to protect Michael's assets immediately. What's the fastest way?" Patrick didn't hesitate. "With the power of attorney and evidence of exploitation, you can contact his financial institutions directly. I can help draft the emails and make the calls with you. We can frame it as suspected fraud, which frankly it is." For the next 2 hours, Patrick guided me through the process remotely. Using Michael's laptop, which James had retrieved from his office, we accessed his accounts and began the process of protection. We froze the joint checking and savings accounts, suspended the credit cards, and placed alerts on his investment accounts. We documented everything, meticulously saving screenshots of Natalie's extravagant charges alongside her Instagram posts showing her partying while the charges were made. We compiled the text messages showing her neglect of Michael's deteriorating health. We saved the emails about the life insurance policy. "This is an impressive paper trail," Patrick commented. "If she challenges this legally, you've got substantial evidence of breach of fiduciary responsibility, at minimum possibly criminal neglect." I also called our family lawyer back in Arizona, who promised to connect me with a reputable colleague in Washington by morning. "In the meantime," she advised, "document everything. Take photos of Michael's condition, get statements from the medical staff about their attempts to contact Natalie and her lack of response." By evening, I had secured Michael's financial assets, established my authority with the medical team, and begun creating a legal case should it become necessary. I booked a hotel room near the hospital, but had no intention of using it yet. I wouldn't leave Michael alone again. Susan helped me arrange a cot in Michael's room for the night. "We're not supposed to do this," she admitted, "but after what I've seen, I'm making an exception." As night fell, I sat beside Michael holding his fevered hand and talking to him softly about memories from his childhood, about his father, about anything positive I could think of. Doctors believe that even unconscious patients can sometimes hear, and I wanted my voice to be a beacon guiding him back. "I'm here, Michael," I whispered. "Mom's handling everything. You just focus on getting better." I dozed fitfully on the cot, waking at every change in the beeping monitors or when nurses came in for checks. Despite my exhaustion, a strange calm had settled over me. I had done what needed to be done. I had protected my son in the only way available to me. Whatever happened next, I would face it head on. The storm arrived precisely 1 hour after the last credit card was suspended. The commotion in the hallway startled me from a light doze. Angry voices, one in particular rising above the others, followed by the measured tones of hospital staff attempting to maintain order. "I don't care about your visiting hours. That's my husband in there." The voice was unmistakably Natalie's, shrill with indignation. I rose from the cot and straightened my rumpled clothes, steeling myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. The ICU door flew open, and Natalie stormed in looking nothing like her polished Instagram photos. Her makeup was smudged, hair disheveled, designer dress wrinkled. She stopped short when she saw me, shock registering on her face, before quickly morphing into artificial concern. "Elsie, what a surprise. When did you get here?" The false warmth in her voice couldn't mask the panic in her eyes. "Yesterday afternoon, Natalie, after a nurse had to call me because my son had been alone in intensive care for 3 days. She flinched slightly but recovered quickly. "There's been a misunderstanding. I've been here every day. The staff must be confused." "Have you?" I asked calmly. "That's interesting because I have your Instagram post showing you on a yacht yesterday, and at the Thompson cocktail party the day before, and at Le Diplomat for brunch this morning." The facade cracked. "You've been stalking my social media. I've been trying to understand how a wife could be celebrating while her husband fights for his life, alone." Natalie's gaze darted to Michael, then back to me, calculation evident in her expression. "He wouldn't want me sitting around being miserable. Michael understands that life goes on." "Does he?" I gestured to the ventilator, breathing for my son. "Why don't you ask him?" Something ugly flashed across her face. "What I do while my husband is sick is none of your business. You're the one who's out of place here, flying across the country, invading our privacy. Someone needed to be here for him. It should have been you." A nurse appeared in the doorway, clearly concerned about the rising voices. "Is everything all right in here?" "Fine," Natalie snapped, then forced a smile. "Just a concerned mother-in-law overstepping. I'll handle it from here." "Actually," the nurse said, "Dr. Patel asked to speak with Mrs. Morgan about the new treatment protocol for her son. Hospital records show she has medical power of attorney." Natalie's head whipped toward me. "What?" "That's impossible. I'm his wife." "Michael never changed the document after your marriage," I explained quietly. Perhaps he had concerns even then. Her composure shattered completely. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling our bank right now. You'll see who's in charge." I watched silently as she pulled out her phone and accessed her banking app. The color drained from her face as she saw the frozen accounts. She tried another app, then another, growing more frantic with each attempt. "What did you do?" she hissed, advancing toward me. "What the hell did you do to our accounts?" "I protected my son's assets from further exploitation while he's incapacitated." "You had no right," she shrieked loud enough that the nurse took a step into the room. "That's our money. Is it because it looks like you've been spending it quite freely while Michael lies here fighting for his life? $50,000 in 3 days, Natalie, including a yacht charter yesterday. That's our lifestyle. Michael wants me to enjoy life. While you're inquiring about his life insurance policy," I countered, watching her face pale further. "Asking about payout procedures a week before he mysteriously becomes critically ill." The accusation hung in the air between us. I hadn't meant to imply something so terrible, but once the words were out, I couldn't take them back. And worse, I wasn't entirely sure they weren't true. Natalie's shock gave way to cold fury. "You think I had something to do with his illness, you crazy old woman." "I think you saw an opportunity when he got sick. I think you've been taking advantage of his incapacity. And I think you've been neglecting someone who desperately needed your support. I'm calling our lawyer right now." She threatened, fingers already dialing. "You'll regret this, Elsie. You have no idea who you're messing with." "Actually, I do. I'm dealing with someone who parties while their spouse is on life support. someone who can't be bothered to visit the hospital but can manage a full social calendar, someone who's been draining accounts while positioning herself to potentially benefit from her husband's death. My voice remained steady, but inside I was shaking with a mixture of fear and resolve. I had never confronted anyone like this in my life. Thomas had always been the confrontational one. I had been the peacemaker. But Thomas wasn't here, and Michael needed me to be both mother and protector now. A security guard appeared beside the nurse. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, eyeing Natalie's increasingly agitated state. "Yes," I said calmly. "My daughter-in-law is disturbing a critical patient. I have medical power of attorney, and I'm requesting that she leave until she can maintain appropriate behavior in an ICU." "You can't kick me out. That's my husband." "The husband you couldn't be bothered to visit for 3 days," the nurse interjected, her professional demeanor slipping slightly to reveal her disgust. "The husband whose calls for you I personally made only to be told you were too busy." Natalie looked from the nurse to the security guard to me, realizing she was outnumbered. "This isn't over," she spat. "I'll have a court order by morning. You'll be sorry you ever interfered in our marriage." As security escorted her out, her parting shot echoed down the hallway. "You think you're protecting him? You're destroying everything we built." When the commotion finally subsided, I collapsed back into the chair beside Michael's bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted I truly was. The nurse, a different one from Susan but equally kind, brought me a cup of water and a concerned look. "Are you all right, Mrs. Morgan?" "I will be," I assured her, "as soon as my son is." She checked Michael's vitals, adjusting his IV line with practiced hands. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "the staff here is behind you. What we've seen over the past few days, it wasn't right." After she left, I held Michael's hand again, speaking softly to him about nothing in particular, just wanting him to hear a loving voice amid all the tension. I wondered if I had done the right thing, if my actions would ultimately help or hurt him. But when I thought of Natalie's cold dismissal of his needs, of her extravagant partying while he lay fighting for his life, I knew I couldn't have done otherwise. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. "You've made a serious mistake. Hope you're ready for the consequences." I blocked her number without responding and turned back to my son. Whatever storm was coming, I would weather it for him. Thomas and I had promised to protect him, and that promise remained sacred. Days blurred together in the sterile environment of the ICU. I established a routine of sorts, sleeping on the cot beside Michael's bed, showering in the family lounge when nurses insisted I take breaks, eating whatever the cafeteria offered that seemed least offensive. Time lost meaning marked only by the shifts of medical staff and the gradual, almost imperceptible changes in Michael's condition. True to her word, Natalie attempted legal action. A stern-faced lawyer appeared on the 3rd day, serving me with papers challenging the power of attorney and demanding immediate restoration of access to all accounts. The family lawyer I'd contacted had anticipated this move and had already filed counter-motions documenting the evidence of neglect and financial exploitation. "It's going to be a fight," my lawyer warned during a phone consultation while I paced the hospital corridor. "But we have strong evidence. The medical records alone show a pattern of abandonment during critical illness. The financial records show potentially criminal misuse of joint assets during incapacity." Meanwhile, Michael's colleagues formed a rotation, ensuring someone visited every day. They brought fresh clothes for me, home-cooked meals better than hospital fare, and most importantly, updates on the research Michael had been conducting before his collapse. They spoke to him about his work, even though he remained unconscious, describing breakthroughs and challenges in his lab, as if he were an active participant in the conversation. "The Patterson trial is proceeding exactly as you predicted," James told Michael during one visit. "Your protocol is outperforming the control by 17%. The team misses you, but we're keeping everything on track until you're back." On the 7th day, a miracle occurred. I was dozing in the chair beside Michael's bed when a change in the rhythm of the monitors woke me. I opened my eyes to find him looking at me, actually seeing me, his eyes clear for the first time since my arrival. The breathing tube had been removed the previous day when his condition had finally stabilized enough for independent respiration. His voice when he spoke was a raspy whisper from the throat irritation. "Mom, You came. I burst into tears, clasping his hand between both of mine. Of course I came, sweetheart. Of course I did. The medical team rushed in, alerted by the changes in his vital signs. They checked his responsiveness, his cognitive function, his awareness of his surroundings. To everyone's relief, Michael was not only conscious, but lucid, understanding where he was and what had happened to him. When we were finally alone again, Michael asked the question I had been dreading. "Where's Natalie?" I considered sugarcoating the truth, but decided against it. Michael deserved honesty, especially now. "She hasn't been here much, sweetheart. There's a lot we need to talk about, but not until you're stronger." His expression told me he already knew, or at least suspected the truth about his wife's absence. "She didn't think it was serious," he said quietly. "When I first got sick, she kept saying I was being dramatic. You nearly died, Michael. Sepsis is extremely serious." He nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. "I remember calling for her, asking the nurses to call her. Did she come at all?" "Once briefly the first day, and once after I arrived and had taken certain steps to protect you." His eyebrows furrowed. "Protect me how?" I took a deep breath. "I found your medical power of attorney, the one naming me. I used it to make your medical decisions while you were unconscious." I paused, then added, "I also froze your joint accounts and credit cards when I discovered how much money was being spent while you were hospitalized." Instead of the anger or confusion, I half expected relief washed across Michael's face. "Thank you," he whispered. "I've been trying to figure out how to address the spending for months. It just kept escalating, and every time I tried to discuss it, Natalie would turn it around on me, make me feel unreasonable." Over the next few days, as Michael grew stronger, we had a series of difficult conversations. He admitted that his marriage had been troubled for some time. Natalie had changed shortly after their honeymoon, becoming increasingly focused on social status and luxury, dismissive of his work, and resentful of his relationship with me. "I kept thinking it would get better," he explained during one of our talks, "that she was just going through a phase adjusting to marriage." "And the money issues?" I asked gently. Michael sighed. "It started small. Shopping sprees she'd dismiss as necessary for her career in pharmaceutical marketing, expensive dinners with industry contacts that somehow never included me. Then larger purchases, designer furniture, a luxury car lease. I tried to set budgets, but she'd ignore them completely." As his strength returned, so did his clarity about his situation. When I showed him the evidence I had gathered, the social media posts during his hospitalization, the text exchanges, the financial records, his face hardened with resolve. "I want a divorce," he said finally, 2 weeks after regaining consciousness. "I need your help to make that happen while I'm still recovering." With Michael's explicit permission, I engaged the lawyers to begin divorce proceedings immediately. We documented everything meticulously: the medical neglect, the financial exploitation, the evidence suggesting Natalie may have been having an affair with Richard Caldwell, the pharmaceutical executive who appeared in many of her social media posts. Physical therapy began as Michael slowly regained strength. I watched with a mother's pride and concern as he pushed himself through painful exercises, determined to recover fully. The first day he managed to walk the length of the hospital corridor with a walker was a victory we celebrated with smuggled-in ice cream from his favorite local creamery. Natalie made several attempts to visit once it became clear Michael was recovering and divorce was imminent. Each time she was turned away based on Michael's explicit instructions to hospital security. Her lawyer continued filing motions, but our evidence was overwhelming, and preliminary rulings consistently favored Michael's position. The most difficult moment came when Michael was finally strong enough to read the texts Natalie had sent during his illness. Seeing her dismissal of his serious symptoms, her prioritization of social events over his health crisis, broke something in him that I wasn't sure could be repaired. "I thought she loved me," he said, simply setting the phone aside. How could I have been so wrong about someone? I didn't have an answer for him. I only knew that we would get through this together, as we had gotten through every other challenge life had thrown at us. The road to recovery would be long, but he wouldn't walk it alone. 6 months after that fateful flight to Washington, Michael and I sat on the patio of my Arizona home, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. He looked almost like himself again, still thinner than before his illness, with a new seriousness around his eyes, but healthy and whole. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, largely in Michael's favor, due to the overwhelming evidence of Natalie's misconduct. The judge had been particularly disturbed by her absence during his critical illness and the simultaneous extravagant spending. Mr. Morgan nearly died while Mrs. Morgan chartered yachts and attended cocktail parties, the judge had noted in her ruling. This court finds such behavior unconscionable and indicative of the bad faith necessary to override normal community property considerations. Natalie had been granted only her personal possessions and a modest settlement that reflected her actual contributions to the marriage, far less than the 50% she had demanded. Most importantly, Michael had retained his retirement accounts and investments, the very assets that had most concerned me during those first desperate days in the hospital. "I got a call from NIH today," Michael said, breaking our comfortable silence. "They've offered me a position in their Arizona satellite facility. Same research, different location." I tried not to let my joy show too obviously. "Is that something you'd want?" He nodded, smiling slightly. "I think it's time for a fresh start. Washington holds too many memories now, not all of them good." The decision to leave his prestigious position at the main NIH campus hadn't been easy for Michael. He had built his career there, established important research protocols, mentored younger scientists. But the city itself had become associated with trauma, both physical and emotional. "Besides," he added, "someone needs to keep an eye on you. Make sure you're not working too hard with that new patient advocacy group of yours." I smiled at his teasing. In the months since Michael's illness, I had indeed found a new purpose. Witnessing the challenges families faced during medical crises had inspired me to start a support group for relatives of critically ill patients. What had begun as informal coffee meetings had evolved into a recognized hospital program, providing guidance, emotional support, and practical assistance to those navigating the overwhelming world of intensive care. "It gives meaning to what happened," I explained when people asked why I devoted so much time to the group. "It makes some good come from something that could have been utterly devastating." Michael reached over and squeezed my hand. "You literally saved my life, Mom. Twice, really. Once by getting to the hospital when you did, and once by protecting me from what was happening with Natalie." "I made a promise to your father," I said simply, "that we would always protect you. I had to keep it." As the sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple, I reflected on the journey we had taken. The frantic flight to Washington, the horrifying discovery of Michael's condition, the confrontation with Natalie, all of it had led us here to this moment of peace and new beginnings. Michael had emerged from his ordeal not just physically recovered, but emotionally stronger. The experience had stripped away illusions, forced him to confront difficult truths about his marriage, and ultimately freed him from a relationship that had become toxic. For my part, I had discovered reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed. The mild-mannered financial advisor, who had always avoided confrontation, had faced down a threat to her child with fierce determination. I had learned that protecting those we love sometimes requires difficult, even controversial actions. That maternal instinct doesn't diminish with a child's age, it merely transforms. We had also rebuilt our relationship on more equal footing. Michael was no longer just my son whom I needed to protect, but a partner in our shared recovery, each of us supporting the other through the aftermath of trauma. James had flown out to visit the previous weekend, bringing news that Michael's research team had secured a major grant based on the protocols he had established before his illness. "They're calling it the Morgan Protocol now," James had reported proudly. "Your work is changing lives even while you've been recovering." We had celebrated with a small dinner party, James a few local friends, and Bill the kind widower from my support group with whom I'd recently begun a cautious friendship. It was the first time since Michael's illness that our home had been filled with laughter and conversation not centered on medical concerns or legal battles. "I've been thinking about dating again," Michael said now as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Not seriously, not yet, but eventually." "When you're ready," I assured him. "There's no timeline for healing." "I'll be more careful next time," he said with a wry smile. "Maybe run any potential partners by my extremely protective mother first." I laughed. "I promise not to freeze anyone's accounts unless absolutely necessary. Just check their Instagram during medical emergencies." "Exactly." Our shared laughter felt like the final medicine Michael needed, a sign that we could find humor again, even in the darkest of experiences. Life will always bring unexpected challenges, sudden illnesses, betrayals, moments when we must make difficult choices to protect those we love. What matters is not that these challenges come, but how we face them and who stands beside us when we do. I flew to Washington without warning and found my son dying alone while his wife celebrated on a yacht. I took drastic action to protect him, facing down threats and legal challenges. And today, 6 months later, we sit together under an Arizona sunset, both forever changed but stronger for what we've endured. If you've ever had to make difficult choices to protect someone you love, I hope you'll share your story in the comments below. There's healing in knowing we're not alone in these challenging moments. Please like this video if it resonated with you, subscribe to hear more stories of family bonds tested and strengthened through adversity, and share with someone who might need to be reminded that sometimes the fiercest love is the kind that takes action when it matters most. Thank you for being part of this community where we can share our deepest truths and find connection in our common experiences.